Welcome to Kentucky Horsepower, the official podcast of the Kentucky Automobile Dealers Association. Hi, good day, everyone. This is Jason Wilson, president of the Kentucky Auto Dealer Association, and welcome to another edition of our official podcast, Kentucky Horsepower. Joining me today is Steve Gates of Gates Automotive Group here in Kentucky, Central Kentucky, Lexington area. And Steve, happy to have you with us. Thanks for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me.
Just to give I think everyone's fairly familiar in Kentucky with Steve Gates. He was our Time Dealer of the Year back in 2021. That same year, he was also the AIADA Chairman as well. And Steve's been very involved in Kentucky events, but things that go well beyond Kentucky in his various roles. And he's also currently on the KADA Board of Directors. So, Steve, again, thanks for joining us. Today, we want to really sort of get into EVs. You know, there's been a lot of discussion about it, both at the dealer level, the legislative level, you name it. It's really what the last couple of years have been about. And I think we're starting to see a little bit of a pivot of what the OEMs are thinking as it relates to EV is putting out there. So let's just start sort of at a macro level, Steve, and we'll sort of work our way through it. But let's start with, what are your initial thoughts as we sit here in February of 2024? EVs versus just what the conversations were like just a couple years ago.
Yeah, I've really been working on this for, I guess, about 4 years. Really before it was in the press, before it was popular. So frankly, I'm kind of I'm fatigued. This is a long. It's been a long road.
Sure.
But it was very lonely in the beginning. But mostly this, and my involvement was born out of fear.
Yeah.
And I think I told you one time, in my opinion, and it's just that, but in my opinion, if the EPA mandate stands, if it's passed, if it stands, all of us won't make it. All of the number of dealers that we have now, will not be able to continue to be in business, or certainly at least to thrive. For a variety of reasons, but so I've gotten so involved because I don't want to lose my job, and I don't want everybody else in our industry to lose their jobs either. So anyway.
Yeah, it's a great point. And again, you and I have talked through the years on this subject that is evolving. And to that extent, and to that to example of that, we're seeing as an association more and more inquiries from the press here, even just within the last few weeks, saying, what's going on with EVs? We're seeing that EV sales are slowing down, that EV sales are, there was this big movement. Now the press seems to be sort of catching up to what the reality is on the ground. So let's talk about, you carry a number of different brands. What are you seeing at your stores as it relates to your EV inventory?
Well, first of all, we're essentially seeing no activity whatsoever. In all of the brands that I sell, we have at least one EV model.
Sure.
The Toyota, for instance, we have the BZ4X. I have one in stock, and it's the same one I've had in stock since it was introduced. The only reason the door's ever been opened is because occasionally we have to move it to charge it.
Wow.
The zero interest. At Nissan, similar situation. We sold several Nissans a few months ago, but only because Nissan came out with an employee-only program. So the employees could lease a car for 12 months for less than $200 a month. So we sold 5. The dealers across the country did the same thing, so Nissan could show that that their EV sales were growing, but the fact of the matter is they weren't being sold to the public. Honda is just coming out with their Prologue. We haven't received one yet. But for the past year, maybe a little longer than a year, Honda's been all over us as far as preparation. We've had the tools, the special tools for a long time. They're very expensive.
Yes.
And been pushing us on chargers, which we now
Right.
have installed. I'll digress to say, at least in the case of Nissan, our level 3 charger, they provide it. So
Oh,
our expense at Nissan has been very low. They've been very
right.
fair about infrastructure.
Right.
And Toyota hasn't required anything.
Okay.
Uh, then I've got Hyundai, and Hyundai's very aggressive.
Mm-hmm.
They see an all EV future. And of course I have Ford, and it's been reported often that Ford's been pretty heavy-handed as far as preparation for an EV future. Everybody's starting to pivot, and I suspect we'll get to that next.
Yeah, and that sort of was my point. And let's jump right into Ford. As you said, Ford's been, that's well documented as far as what Ford's approach was, and now what it is today is also well documented in that, hey, everybody can sell EVs, service EVs. They've really changed that. Which we as an association actually sent Ford a letter acknowledging that position and encouraging that they continue down this path of communicating with dealers. So it is something that can be inclusive of all dealers, regardless of if you're in a largely populated area or a very small town. As you know, we have a lot of small town Ford dealers as well, where from the standpoint of initially, whether you were in Los Angeles, California, or whether you were in Paducah, Kentucky, the requirements essentially that they were putting out there was the same. So thankfully they've had to pivot on that because it just wasn't working. But what the future looks like, I'm not sure. Here in Kentucky, obviously we see they've invested in Kentucky in these plants and whatnot, but now they're also scaling back. We've seen it with the Ford Lightning. They've announced they're decreasing production on that. So it is interesting, especially from your perspective, Steve, because you have the different brands. You mentioned Hyundai sort of saying we're all in, and we're seeing other ones that are saying maybe not. We're going to pivot, and so as a dealer who owns these different brands, boy, it must be tough to reconcile these different emerging views and ever changing views, right? As far as an overall business plan.
Absolutely, and and it has changed so dramatically a number of different times.
Yeah.
I did have the chance, and this is emblematic of some changes at Ford. Jim Farley used to work at Toyota. Worked at Toyota for a long time. I knew him very well. From my different stints on National Dealer Council, I traveled with him, and really knew him and his family very well. Once he went to Ford, we had no conversation. He was a little busy,
Yeah.
and but I ran into him just at the automotive news booth at NADA.
Okay.
And went up to him and said, Jim, you're not going to remember me. And he said, oh, of course I remember you. And I said, well, I'm a Ford dealer. And he was surprised.
Right.
And I said a little flippantly, I was going to call you a few times because, boy, it's been tough being a Ford dealer. And, I think that your regulations have been a little difficult for me to deal with. I mean, and he goes, yeah, I know. And I promise you that nothing's more important to me than dealer relations. I have no desire. It was always publicized that I wanted to go direct to consumer. And I promise you that was never my intention.
Right.
So I believe him. I mean,
Mhm.
we're standing next to each other and he was looking
Right.
in the eye. But he was very clear. And I think I didn't go to the Ford Make meeting. I had other meetings that were in
Right.
conflict, but both one-on-one and what I've read about the meeting, um, I think he's ready to pivot even more so than
Right.
just allowing all dealers to sell EVs. You know, I think that the Detroit three, and particularly Ford and General Motors, are driven to a large degree, driven by the stockholder value.
Sure.
And when it looked like EV was the future and the public seemed to embrace that, particularly in certain parts of the country,
Right.
it made sense for them to jump on board. You look at Tesla, you look at the value of Tesla,
Right.
and their first job, Mary Barras, who I don't know, and Jim
Mhm.
Farley, their first responsibility is to their shareholders. It's not
Mhm.
to the dealers.
Right.
And I think they demonstrated that very clearly. But to that point, when the public seemed to reject an EV future,
Mhm.
and people weren't buying their cars again, with a nod toward shareholder value, they had to back up and are
Absolutely.
continuing to do so.
Yeah, and look, we're seeing this throughout the country. Here in Kentucky, currently, new car sales that make up EVs, it hovers right around 2%, and it's been pretty consistent there. Whereas California, it's 25% approximately new car sales in that range. But again, it's sort of flatlining, which sort of begs the question, and I think this is why we're seeing some of these corrections, if you will, were the early adopters really the only adopters for this sort of thing, in that it fits with the lifestyle that they have to be an EV owner. It fits with their daily habits. It fits with their ability to have charging overnight and those sort of things. And as you know, in Kentucky, we are so far away from being having that infrastructure that we can do that. Maybe we shouldn't be that surprised, and maybe there should have been a little bit more due diligence ahead of this commitment. And so we're seeing polling now as it relates to EV attitudes, but where was it all those years, just a few years ago?
Well, and the early adopters, the one thing that's similar among all is they have another car,
Right.
the Tesla that they bought, and they're all primarily Teslas.
Right.
That was not their only car.
Yep.
They had a garage.
Mm-hmm.
They had a place to charge their own car. They didn't have to find public charging.
That's right.
So it was a different buyer.
Yeah.
Now we see, even in California, I have a lot of dealers, friends that are dealers in California, and people are trading in their Teslas,
Mm-hmm.
and they're shocked that they have very little value.
Right.
Partially because of price reductions by Tesla. But
Right.
the other thing is nobody knows and it's a big problem. How do you evaluate the worth of the battery electric vehicle? How much
Right.
battery is left? I mean, as you know, if the battery in your flashlight, the first day is the best day. They
Right.
trade every day thereafter. It's
Yep.
no different in a battery electric vehicle. So what's that car worth after you've had it a few years?
Yeah.
How have you treated it?
Mhm.
As a somebody who's appraising used cars, what do you do?
Yeah.
I think that's a huge problem that really hasn't. I see that it's just starting to be discussed now, but the but we see a lot, at least in California, and I don't have any data, but at least in California, we're seeing people that are trading in Teslas and they're not buying another electric
Right.
vehicle.
Right. And you're right. I don't have anecdotal data on this as well, but in speaking just some dealers loosely, they've talked about, as you've mentioned, uh, taking Tesla trade-ins, and that is a big question. What really is that value? Which sort of brings me to the next point. As we talk about, we look at these EPA proposed requirements, whatnot. So given the state of the market that we just sort of laid out, yet the very aggressive benchmarks that have been put forward specifically in the 2027 to 2032, 60% of new vehicles sold in 2030, 67.5% of new vehicles sold in 2032 to be EVs. How does this get reconciled?
Well, I don't know that we know.
Right.
So the EPA regs have been sent to the Office of Management Budget,
Right.
the OMB. If they're accepted as written, the cake's baked.
Right.
We hear that there may be, those regulations may be tweaked before they're announced. It may include plug-ins as well as battery electric. It's going to exclude hybrids. So the regulations will be pretty much, we're told, nobody knows for sure, but we're told that outside of adding plug-in, that this is going to pass. As you know, you were in Vegas, and Secretary Granholm was very clear, and she used the word, we're not pumping the brake. She took that from the letter that we wrote to the president about pumping the brake. There were 12 of us that wrote that letter to the president, which 5,000 dealers signed on to that.
That's
letter,
right.
So, the president has taken a stand. I don't think that he can back up much, which leads us to in the next general election, if there's a change, this isn't a political statement, it's just a fact. If there's a change, that maybe there would be, by executive action or new legislation, or probably defunding of the EPA, we can change the direction. But that's to be seen, and a lot of it's all political, which is we all keep trying to influence, but
it makes it a really tough spot for all of us in this industry to be in, whether you're a dealer or a manufacturer. A change in administration, and presumably, I think we can expect that, barring something unforeseen, and who knows, it's a wild world we're living in, Trump will be the nominee of the Republican Party, and it looks to be at this point a Trump-Biden rematch. And Trump has been very vocal on his views as it relates to EV, not in a very flattering way by any means. But if you do have that change, again, it's not like everything can just stop on a dime, as everything's been in motion as it relates to do these things. So that's going to be an issue moving forward. And as we always say in here, elections have consequences one way or another, whichever side you're on. One thing, the other thing I wanted to touch on this, and you and I have had this conversation, I know you study this very closely, is what drives all of this moving forward and is moving into EV are the batteries themselves. And you touched on that earlier as it relates to trade-ins and what that can look like, but the sourcing of these batteries, Steve, I mean, let's talk about that a little bit. Give us your thoughts on, what that can look like and where the problems are there.
Well, you and I talked about a while back that OPEC controls so much of our oil production and the pricing of oil. China has become the new OPEC. 90%, roughly 90% of the production of minerals for batteries comes from China. The various minerals, China controls between 60 and 90% of the 5 minerals that are used to build batteries. That's a huge concern.
Absolutely.
China announced not that long ago that they were going to cut back on the export of graphite. Demonstrating that they have that they just have control. And if they decide all of a sudden, if the Chinese government decides that they don't like something we're doing, and so they counter
Right.
by restricting all minerals, that would be devastating.
Absolutely.
Some of these minerals are available in North America, but how quickly will those mining companies be able to get permission to dig? And I don't know about you, but I don't want to mine next door to me.
Right.
And so it takes a long time to get permits to dig. So that's a huge issue. And
Yeah, and Steve, I think it's something that's not talked about enough. On the one hand, we have state governments and the federal government saying, don't get on TikTok because that's China runs TikTok, right? On the other hand, we're talking about turning over our energy needs and requirements to fulfill these EV mandates to who? To China. So this is where this void in common sense is really scary and puts everybody in a tough spot. And so I'm going to touch on one last thing before I wrap up, because again, you have some interesting perspectives based on the things you're involved with, the various roles that you are working in currently. And one is you're currently chairman of the PAC of the American for Free International Trade, and you're talking to legislators about this. So as things evolve, what are you seeing? Are legislators educating themselves on this? Do they get sort of the things that we're talking about here in a way? What's your take on that?
They didn't.
Yeah.
When we first started talking about this 3 or 4 years ago, a lot of blank stares.
Right.
Now everybody seems, or most seem to get it. In fact, from the leader McConnell's office, they're now sending me articles about EV and the fact that consumers are not interested in these cars. They were surprised in the beginning that the public has had this reaction, particularly in Kentucky.
Right.
But it runs party lines as you would expect.
Sure.
Most of the time. But not always. The thing that the most interesting thing to me during my trips, many trips to Washington, is that talking to the Michigan delegation, Republicans and Democrats, mostly Democrat.
Yeah.
They were shocked because they had been told that there was that there was just such a huge pent up demand,
right,
for EVs, and one member, who asks not to be, you might be able to figure out who it is, but she said, don't quote me, she says,
right.
but there's a huge demand for the Lightning. She goes, I know there's a huge demand. And I said, respectfully, there's not. I'm a Ford dealer. And maybe a lot of Kentucky Ford dealers did this, but I worked really hard to get orders for Lightning. I thought I was the smartest Ford dealer in the country. And I had 25 or 30 orders for Lightning. And for a small Ford dealer like me, that was fantastic.
Sure.
Until people found out that you couldn't tow with them, you couldn't haul anything, and the battery range was far less than advertised. So I've got some Lightning. So is anybody watching this today, any dealer watching this that needs a dealer trade for a Lightning, I'm your guy.
Right. Well, and that's what we're hearing too, Steve. Like over the last several months, a lot of these sales have been dealer to dealer, right? They're sending them out. And so you have dealers in the middle part of the country selling to Northern Virginia dealers or
Yes.
things of that nature. So we're seeing a lot of that. Look, this will be something we're going to continue to follow. It's going to continue to evolve. It's going to be at the forefront of all of us who are in this industry in our lives for the foreseeable future. We have an election coming up. I think this topic heats up even more as we get closer to election day. We'll see what happens, and at some point, I'd like to revisit this with you, and we'll mark this date down as here we are, mid-February. Let's see where we're looking at 3-4 months from now. It could be even more vastly different than where we're sitting today.
I hope so, and I hope it's positive. Let me say one thing, and I think it's really important. I think we all, as dealers and manufacturers, we're anxious to capture carbon. We're not anti-environment.
Absolutely.
But we have to move into this sensibly.
Right.
We have to allow for other technology. We're short-sighted if we think that battery electric is the only path
Right.
to being carbon neutral.
Right.
So, I don't want to be characterized, and I don't think any Kentucky dealer wants to be characterized as being anti-environment.
Yep. I think that's a great point. And to that extent, anti-EV. I mean, EVs have their place. There is a role, and there's no better way to sell and service EVs than through the dealer network. But the industry, as long as I've been in it, and I'm sure you would say the same, has largely been consumer driven, right? It's what's evolved in what the consumer wants is what the OEMs make, and that's what makes it work. That's how everybody competes, and that's where everything moves forward and evolves. Dealers have been the ambassadors of new technology for generations. So it's not that, it's the sheer number with the government saying this is what they're going to be. Consumers ultimately still have the final say.
That's right.
Well, with that, Steve Gates, thank you for joining us here today. I feel like this has been a really interesting conversation, one we'll certainly continue and track moving forward. And for those of you listening, thank you for being part of this edition of Kentucky Horsepower, and we'll see you on the road.